This in the context of dSpace, but it doesn't just apply to dSpace. It can also apply to any web properties or anything. Because sadly, no one wants to talk about dSpace. So just to give you an idea, Cal Poly Pomona is part of the 23 system, the CSU system. So many of us are on a multi-tenant dSpace instance where we don't have a whole lot of control. There are certain functions that you would, as an administrator in dSpace, be able to do that we can't do. We wouldn't be able to edit any code or site code specifically. We'd have to get, for example, our Google Analytics snippets put in by the programmer at the Chancellor's office. And we also don't have really great access to the already not so great statistics. So, and there's some other features we can't really do. So we needed to find an alternative that we could go in and basically manipulate our analytics in a way that we wanted to. So the first goal was really to track downloads from our repositories called Bronco Scholar in Google Analytics, because it's not a feature that's automatically there. If anyone was at Code for Lib this last year, I think it was Josh Wilson, that talked about event tracking and custom variables in Google Analytics. But he's specifically talking about adding more code to the snippet to do those things. And what I'm talking about is using Google Tag Manager to do that instead. And also, I wanted to track certain metadata and download statistics, and where possible also in page views, because I want to be able to go in and say, this author had this many downloads, or this author had this many page views, which were then converted to downloads. And we couldn't really do that with what we had. And I did mention this doesn't just apply to dSpace. If you have events or dimensions that you'd like to track in a web property, you can do that there as well. So first off, I should say that half of this, so tracking downloads in Google Tag Manager, was actually presented at LIDA. But she was doing something a little bit different, and we took it a step further with the dimensions. And what she does is, Summer Durant, who's at the University of Virginia now, what she does is she's really interested in tracking file types, and she's doing a lot of analysis with specific file types. So what she was doing was more complicated than what I found here, which is the simplified version of I just want to track how many downloads I had. I can see what file type they are, but I don't need to do a whole lot of manipulation with file types. But we still needed information about the downloads, such as author and title, and I actually want to be able to pull up reports and not have to do too much normalizing to figure out what happened where. So this is what we're doing, is custom dimensions in Google Tag Manager and Google Analytics. This is the Google Analytics screen. So this is just an example that we're tracking content types. So I can say on this date we had 21 downloads specifically for student research objects in our repository. So I think what Josh Wilson was talking about differently too, he was talking about variables which allow you to track even sections of pages. I'm talking about dimensions. So these are just additional attributes and descriptors that you can add. So you can add additional columns in Google Analytics and look at the data a little differently. And when you look at any Google documentation on dimensions, they're always going to talk about metrics as well. We haven't really started looking at or completely understanding metrics, but what I think we want to do is to use a metric of a conversion rate, for example, to look at those page views and see how many downloads there were. So the metric just basically manipulates the dimension to give sums or ratios, really. So simple, Google Analytics account is important, Google Tag Manager account. We did everything with free accounts, you don't need to get more accounts, and then the code snippet needs to be implemented on the site. There is a code snippet for Google Tag Manager, depending on how you set up containers, because that's what we're called in Google Tag Manager. You may or may not have to implement that the additional Google Analytics code. It just depends how you're tracking page views. You can track them in Google Tag Manager and have them sent to Google Analytics, or you can track them in Google Analytics. So it depends how you're configuring it, whether or not you want it implemented on your site. The Google Analytics code, you do need the Google Tag Manager code. And I'm just going to call these GA and GTM because they're a mouthful. So nuts and bolts of GTM, it's an easy solution to update tags on websites. It sidesteps that need to edit code. So if you were trying to track a PDF download, you'd have to insert something like this within your link. And it eliminates that code. It also eliminates the need to edit the code snippet with the specific information. And you control all your information then, or all the tags that you want to fire within a container. And these are the, Google Tag Manager has 3 pieces in this container that work with one another. So the tags are the most important thing. They're actually what gets the job done. So whatever you want to measure, page views or downloads, The rules are the instances that the tags should be fired. So should they be fired on all pages? Should they be fired when someone clicks a download? And macros are the JavaScript really that makes it happen. So a tag is fired that references a macro, for example, when a user clicks on a link that connects to a certain file type. So that's what we're actually doing with one of our tags. So there's a rule that it fires, that a link listener fires on all pages, and then it references that specific macro. And so this is just an example of one of the tags. So the tag name, I'm tracking downloads here. This is in Universal Analytics, and there's my ID. And then these are the important parameters. This is what's going to show up in Google Analytics. It's going to say download as the event that happened. So that's how I know, oh, my event is a download. It's referencing a document type macro, which basically just strips out all the extra text from whatever that file name is and returns PDF or XLS or whatever. And then the link pref, that one, that senses the file format. So it's referencing these different macros, and then it's firing on download link clicks. So basically, there's a tag that's listening for links on the page, or listening for link clicks on the page, and when someone clicks on a link, then this tag is fired, recording the download. So that basically was based on what I had seen someone else do, and is sort of the basis of how we took it a step further to do custom dimensions. So this was basically the best blog that I really found that talks about this. And it doesn't just talk about downloads, it's also talking about outbound links and some other event tracking in using GTM in GA. And so basically I have two tags that are set up, the link click listener, which listens for the clicks, and then there's the download. So once something is down, like a specific file type is clicked on, that's fired as a tag. And the all pages, the tag link click listener listens for, it basically is fired on all pages, and the download tag is only fired when someone actually does that, clicks on something that's a certain file type. And then the macros are basically what's telling it, like explain the document type strips out all information except that final file format, and then the link pref is just returning the file format. So this is what I already had set up, and this was based on that LIDA presentation and the different blogs that I have read. So this is the link click listener, and you see the rule. The macros aren't seen, so there's sort of, you have to go in and add additional macros in the container. And so each container has these three different pieces that you have to edit to make them all work together. And there are some macros that are already set up, and you just have to go in and you can pull in certain rules or tags. And one of the big problems I've noticed is there isn't a whole lot of documentation about GTM yet. So it's hard to figure out exactly what you need to do, because Google has a lot more literatures, for example, on doing CVS imports for custom dimensions on their site, versus they don't really talk about it with Google Tag Manager. So I think it's because it's such a new product that over time they're going to develop more and more documentation to be able to do these kinds of things. So we were able to track those downloads, but the problem is that that's great, but I also want to run promotions. I want to be able to say who had the most downloads last week as a student. Let's congratulate them. Let's call the school paper and try to run an article. They had 2,000 downloads or something. And we can't really do that if we're spending too much time figuring out, well, which download is which based on the file names. So the first thing I looked at was the data import function in Google Analytics. There's a lot of documentation on this. You're manually uploading CSV files to basically widen dimensions. So you create I took a metadata dump from dSpace, and I just pulled only 4 columns that I wanted to use. I wanted author and title and content type, and I wanted the faculty advisor. And so I cleaned up that file so it only had those 4 types, and you map, the key is, you have to use the file name as the primary key, and then all the other paths you set up then in Google Analytics to receive that data. And this does work, but it's problematic because it's not retroactive, so you don't see, like, however long it takes you to upload that CV is when you're going to start seeing the actual data and being able to actually track it. I had to edit that CV a lot, There was a problem with the metadata dump from dSpace that the quotations weren't formatted properly. They were weird, wonky Unicode. And there were extra fields, or in some cases a metadata field that split into 2 columns, so I had to merge the columns. So it was really manual. And there was also, in some of the articles about dimension widening, they mention the APIs for dimension widening. Now there's not a whole lot of actual blogs written about, well, how do we actually use those, but they exist. So technically there has to be a way to use them. So we tried, Alfredo tried a lot of this, was scraping the site and dumping the specific metadata fields we wanted into a CSV. This did work and the data was cleaner, but we would have still had to run a process. So for example, if we uploaded 20 items on a Tuesday and that process didn't run till Wednesday morning, we would miss anybody that downloaded that new. And if you're publicizing RSS feeds or anything, you know, you could miss a whole lot of opportunities to track those downloads. So it still wasn't automatic. And there was an article I found about it was basically someone from e-commerce who was using Google Tag Manager to track optimized keywords on websites, and he was doing session tracking, so it was more important to him to see what the user was experiencing over the entire visit to the website. And what we're doing was slightly different, but this was along the right vein. So that comes to the point that based on what this particular blogger was talking about, it started to make sense of how you could use meta tags basically to check. You can read the meta tags in Google Tag Manager, tell a macro to read the meta tags, and then spit those right into Google Analytics as those custom dimensions. So theoretically it was possible. So I'm just going to talk through exactly what we had to set up. And the reason I had these slides, and I told Gary, was because when this worked, the day that it worked, I was like, I need to write this all down right away, because I'm going to forget what I did. Because it was you know, maybe 6 months of playing around with Google Tag Manager when you have a spare moment to say, I know this should work, but it's not working yet. So basically in Google Analytics, you have to set up custom dimensions. So they have a custom definitions section under admin, and that's one of the options. So you can have up to 20 dimensions for free. And it's important in this case that I set this up as a hit because I don't want the session data to get inherited for example, the meta tag for an author then is across the entire session, but they're on a different item. So for me, it was really important that it was tracking hits and not tracking sessions or users. You can also track product, but I'm not even sure what that means. And then the index number is really important because this was then how you map that from Google Tag Manager to Google Analytics and make sure they're talking to one another. So I should say I had downloads already configured, so I'm not going to show the actual containers, the container draft with the rules and macros and tags that I used for that, because that's available in that one blog with tons of screenshots. And I can share these slides with anyone who'd like them to get more information about that first step of setting up downloads. I added 2 macros. There was the data layer macro that holds the information for that specific dimension, and then basically a macro to track whatever I wanted to track. And I had to set up one for each element. And what I wanted to do was I wanted to check faculty advisors and authors and titles and content types. Now there's only going to be one title and one content type, but there will be multiple authors and there will be multiple faculty advisors. So I broke those into separate macros because the macros are actually doing different things. And they're basically just custom data JavaScript that collect the information from the page. And I pulled a screenshot. The data layer setups are really easy. Just say, when you set up a macro, you have all these options that you select from, and I've only used a few of these, really, mostly the data layer variable and the custom JavaScript options. And so this is just creating where that information can be captured. And this was the macro that does all the work. So this is the JavaScript that then says, go look for the DC contributor field and bring back the text that's in it. And this is specifically for the faculty advisor. And so it has to be an array, so it collects multiple. In the case that we're doing title and content type, we didn't have to have an array in it. But the return text is really important. In Google Tag Manager, it doesn't work if there's not a return function. So it's just really simple JavaScript at the end of the day. We did have some issues with metadata in dSpace. Now, I don't know if this is a dSpace issue or if this is an our instance theme issue, and I've asked our chancellor's office about this, and we're not really sure yet, but we have a lot of contributor fields. So because we have advisors we're tracking authors as a contributor field. We're also tracking in some cases, like if a developer worked on it, like an instructional designer had worked on a specific learning object, we want to track him. So he's in here too as contributor.other. But what happens in our theme is the meta tags actually strip out the end of the metadata field. So, and it also changes DC contributor author to creator. Which worked out for us because then we didn't have a big problem between advisors and authors. But that was weird. So it didn't map completely to the Dublin core objects, and I'm not sure why that is.
Is it converting from qualified to simple Dublin core?
Possibly. Yeah, so that was one of the problems, but it ended up working out for us.
So the question I have, because you were talking about how it's actually reading in the page, and the tag manager is working in the page, but we're talking about simple record, right?
Well, no, it's simple or full.
Okay, so...
And it's because if you look at the meta tags...
Is the markup in there regardless of whether it's... Okay.
Yeah, because that was one of the problems. I thought, well, if it's... Because when we were looking at scraping the site, we had to scrape the full records.
Right.
So, but the simple record view, no, these are all the meta tags.
But this is all in the up above in the meta, okay.
Yeah, so it... That was a problem we had, but it's still functional. The only problem is with that one particular dimension that I want to track, a faculty advisor, I also get their department, and in some cases I get that instructional designer. For the most part, when I'm looking at faculty advisors, though, I'm not looking for learning objects, I'm looking for student research. So it is easy for me to sort that data out, but that's something that is a downfall if you have a lot of detailed metadata. And if you're tracking all of these kinds of things like we'd like to track. So that was one of the issues. The third thing that we did was the index that was configured in Google Analytics then is referenced in this tag. And this is the same tag that I showed earlier for the events, for downloads. And I just had to add, really simply, the indexes for the Google Analytics dimensions that I entered, and also the macros I want them to reference. And then it worked. So, and this is an example of like when the titles fed in, just of showing specific events. And I could see this working for a lot of different purposes, not just for what we're doing. It just depends what you want to track and what kind of data you want to analyze. So then I wanted to take it further because I think it's important to understand who's being downloaded, but I also want to know who's not being downloaded. So are they going to their page and then not clicking on the PDFs? Or are they not interested? Or does someone have high conversion rates and someone else doesn't? Is there something about our display or our metadata? Or just trying to think out some of those instances. So I added another tag to Universal Analytics that basically is just a page view tag. And this again has the same custom dimensions and references these macros again. And this allows me to do more, just more conversion analysis. And also, then there are two things I can maybe brag about. Like, this author had this many page views, and they had this many downloads, which isn't the same amount, but there is some interest in at least accessing different things. So that was an added plus with being able to track page views. And then this is very similar. If you go into page views and you look at under, in Google Analytics, I think this is under site content, they then have the actual pages that are accessed. And of course, this means nothing to me when I'm looking at Google Analytics. I don't know what handles what. So now it's meaningful because I actually have the titles and I can sort by different dimensions if I want. So this is my complete setup. I didn't talk about outbound links because it's very similar to event tracking and download tracking. But what I'm doing with that is I want to, for example, if we have an article from a faculty member who requires that we link out to the database where it's actually published, I can track that now too. And so I can see, well, did they go click on the full text of the article or not the post-print, but the actual published version. So, but that's also talked about in that initial article from Fourth Source, like how they set that up. Helpful tips and frustrations. I feel like in the beginning I'm always muddling through Google Analytics because there's so much you can do with it. It just doesn't make any sense to me, yeah. So there's setting up a catch-all view eliminates problems with, I think this is particularly important if you have a lot of filters. So we use filters for filtering out administrative traffic so that I can actually see who's actually downloading. And I don't think we can do that in dSpace with the statistics that we get from the Chancellor's Office.
Yeah.
So that was a plus, that you can actually filter out admin traffic. But the second you put a filter on a view in Google Analytics, all that data has been processed and that's how it is. So, and you can't take back anything you've done with a filter. So it's really important to set up that catch-all view. And I also set up a test view that included administrator traffic so I could see that things were working. So basically I have three. I have production, test, and then I have my catch-all. GTM tips and tricks. This is really stupid, but the publisher container link where take this live, you don't always notice it. I'm like, why is it not working? Oh, I didn't press the button.
Not as stupid as not pressing the button.
Yeah. So it is also, I had to be descriptive about what I changed because there were so many little tweaks, especially because most of the, for example, with the outbound links that we were working on, it's all in regular expressions, and trying to get those URLs absolutely correct for exclude these types of content took a couple tries. So I kept writing in what I had changed. So, and each time you publish a container, it basically adds it to your list of published or currently live or previously published containers. And when you just have 1, 2, 3, 4 up until 38, that means nothing. But when you actually say what it is, that's helpful. Because you can then go back and recover a container that was working before if you break something.
So do you just actually release the URL for this after publishing, or you just use it so that you can drag the data from that location?
Well, when you publish, well, you have to have the snippet in the site first, of course. And when you publish, you have a debug option too. You can go in and you can see what it looks like on the page. But when you're publishing, it's actually firing the tags then on dSpace or the pages.
Right, because I'm talking about the result, the analysis. But so you're just talking about installing the tag, installing the
yeah, setting up the container. So, and if they're firing properly, and that's the next part, is that it doesn't work right away, and I don't know that Google says anywhere how long it really takes. So I noticed that I publish the container, I download a couple things, go get a coffee, talk to a colleague, come back, and maybe it works, or maybe wait an hour. It didn't seem to be consistent either. So and also with Google Analytics, it's generally the next day you can see everything that happened, but some of the real-time stuff just is hard to understand exactly when it's appearing in the stats. Also, I don't know much about, when I was writing all these tags, I was wondering, well, I don't want to fire too many tags on these pages. How many is too many? And so looking at some of the blogs that others were writing about that specifically, it looks like about 4. So we're firing 2 tags. We're firing a link click listener, and we're firing, so listening for links and also a page view tracker. So we're firing 2 tags until someone clicks somewhere else, and then another tag could be fired. So also custom dimensions, these will take effect and be accessible across all views in your property. You can't really change that, but it's just an option in the dropdown. So it doesn't change your data like a filter changes it. It just adds an additional feature to be able to analyze your data. So the initial dimensions that I had when I had uploaded those CSV files, they're still in Google Analytics, and I can still look at them.
Do you have multiple, well, I don't know how many collections you have in your dSpace, but are there any issues stemming from different collections with different elements, mapped collections?
No, it just reads. It's just reading that one item
page. So it's just
page.
the handled page that it's okay.
Yeah, and if it's not finding the meta tags on the collection pages.
Right.
So it's firing to listen for things, but it's not finding them, so it's not recording. And it's not recording downloads from that page either, because you have to go to the item page to download. And they're also not retroactive. So ours started working about a week and a half, 2 weeks ago. So. This is a problem, and it was funny because that link I included from the LIDA presentation, I actually realized as I was adding it, how is she possibly tracking her downloads, because she's linking directly to the PDF. And so I did a little bit of researching, and obviously you can't fire a tag on a PDF. You have to fire a tag on the page before the PDF. So things that are being linked directly from Google search, and in the case with dSpace, I was playing around with different search terms. So if I search for the actual name of the whatever I'm trying to download, I'll get the PDF first, and then I'll get the item record in dSpace. And if I click on the second one, everything works. But if I click on the first one, that's not going to be captured because it's a direct link to a PDF. So what's good, certainly if you still have all your dSpace statistics or general statistics, you'll be able to see those discrepancies. And so I did talk to our Chancellor's Office, CSUs, I did talk to Aaron about it, and he's still recording those links. So there is a way to compare what the difference is coming from Google search. But the links in Google Scholar, they go to the item record, they don't go to the direct PDFs. So it's a little bit of loss, but you're still capturing a whole lot, I think. And that's it. Questions?
That was a really awesome presentation.
We couldn't have had better timing either because lunch just arrived. I'll have to confess that I was just reminded about 5 minutes ago that the drinks haven't been on ice. So